Today I'm going to narrow the focus a little bit from the world history that carried us to Columbus's voyage in 1492 down to a closer view of American history. Today I'm going to argue that Columbus's discovery initiated a competition for the vast resources of the New World, one involving many players, including multiple native tribes and European nation-states. The traditional image of colonial American history looks like this. It emphasizes English settlements, the original 13 colonies, and moves from east into the west. Here are the 13 colonies, and you can just see their lines spreading across the continent. But I live in Texas, and out here, American history looks a little different. Out here in Texas, we know that Spain was here first, before the English settled the East Coast. Texas remained part of the Spanish Empire until well into the 19th century, which had reached here from the south, not from the east. The Spanish Empire climbed north into the region we call Texas and stayed. The evidence of this alternative history is all around us, or rather, all the way up through San Antonio, where the Alamo is just one of a series of missions, at least 6 or 7 remaining. Well, even more than that, a pattern of conquest and settlement that stretches from the south, from New Spain into the north. These missions around San Antonio, in particular, were built by the Spanish between 1718 and 1730, and they demonstrate the Spanish history of Texas. The Alamo is one of these missions, and teaches us to refocus our view of American history away from what the next lecture will call the English coast. So today's lecture is going to try to convey a sense of the race for the New World, a conquest and settling of the Americas by different European nations. They competed with one another for the vast resources of the New World, establishing different systems for exploiting the New World's land and people, different systems of settlement, culture, morals. In fact, one goal of this lecture is to replace this map with this one. This map shows the English coast was just the edge of a vast empire controlled by other nations. All this interior is claimed and controlled by France, and all this part is claimed and controlled by Spain. The English had just a toehold on this continent, just their little tippy toes, while France and Spain claimed or influenced vast tracts of land. Today I'm going to compare the French and Spanish empires with the English, which I'll cover more thoroughly next time. I'll also provide some information about the presence of the Dutch in the story of American history, and a few other forgotten native and European participants as well. The histories of these different actors and empires help us understand the paths of American history more thoroughly than the traditional tale of only English colonies. Because, for more than a century, European expansion was dominated by Spain and Portugal. Here I am, at the top of the outline. All the material so far has just conveyed the who, what, where, when, and what I'm arguing about how European conquest of the Americas was a game with many players. So now we turn back to the Iberian Peninsula, because more than a century before English settlers landed on the east coast of North America, Spain and Portugal were in a race for empire, competing with each other for land, trade routes, and resources. This is the basis for these explorations and voyages we looked at in the last lecture. Portugal was usually first, the first mover in the history of European empire, because the Portuguese had completed the Volta and were sailing further, setting sail from the Canary Islands, where they had sugar plantations using slave labor. First came the voyage of Bartolomé Diaz in 1488, sticking close to the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and into the Indian Ocean. 10 years later, in 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama also sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and landed in India. On this map, the Portuguese Empire is highlighted in green, and in this one, you can see all the territory Portugal ever claimed marked all at once, though not held all at the same time, marked in red on a map of the world. For example, in 1500, the Portuguese had taken the Volta as far as they could out into the Atlantic and landed in Brazil, where they settled a colony to grow sugar, to turn into liquor and candy, sugar for sale in Europe. In most of the Portuguese Empire, as you can see, the Portuguese kept pretty close to the coast, along the coast of Africa, but also at the edges of India and the Horn of Africa, as this region is called. And here, in the Spice Islands, the Portuguese were mostly interested in commerce, in shipping goods, trading with the interior, but not controlling it. Brazil here looks like the exception, since the Portuguese Empire extends all the way inland. But in fact, you can see that in Brazil, most people live along the coast. You can see there's less population density inland, and most of the population and the cities are on the coast too. To Brazil, the Portuguese exported the colonial system they had established on the Canary Islands, plantations, large-scale farms worked by slaves imported from Africa. What did they grow there? Sugar. And this is how plantations came to America, at the hands of the Portuguese. Spain took a different tack. Here's the Spanish Empire all at once, and you can see it. If this is the Portuguese Empire, then this is the Spanish version. Instead of controlling trade, the Spanish tried settling and extracting. They found gold and silver in South America, and that sold even better than sugar did. So they engaged in a lot of mining. They established mines, and they used violence to force Native Americans to work in them. They enslaved Native South Americans to do the work. So let's return for a moment to Native American history. I've gotten here to Spain and extractive enterprise, especially mining, and now we're going to revisit those South and Mesoamerican cultures that I spoke about in an earlier lecture. I talked at great length about the history of some Native Americans, their agricultural systems, the social structures that relied on the production of corn, the mythologies that animated these societies. I talked about Mayas, Aztecs, and Incas. I talked about Mesoamerican civilizations, but I didn't say much about how they ended. We know the Mayan Empire ended badly. Here's Chichen Itza, and an image of the Mayan social structure with its hierarchies and the specialization of human function and the resulting social inequality based around the cultivation of corn. But now I want to return to the Aztec civilization and later the Inca civilization. I talked about how these have very specific ending dates, and now I'm going to talk about how they came to an end. Aztec civilization, remember, was in roughly the same place as Mexico, and its capital was at Tenochtitlan in present-day Mexico City. Tenochtitlan was a city of about 200,000 people, the same as Europe's two largest cities at the time, Paris and Naples. But after 1492, and the first landing of Columbus's ships, smallpox decimated the population, even before many of them saw Europeans. Disease could be passed down a long line of traders from the coast and the European arrivals, through chains of people and goods, until someone at the end of the chain could get sick and die without ever having seen patient zero. So by the time Hernando Cortés arrived from Spain, the Aztec Empire was already contracting. Its peoples were dying by diseases brought by the European explorers. Cortés, though, was not only an explorer, he was a conquistador, a conqueror. Cortés landed in the Americas in 1519 and set out for the Aztec capital city, and he collected soldiers as he went. Remember that the Aztec Empire was a hierarchical, unequal society, which means there was some dissatisfaction, plenty of people to sign up to march on Tenochtitlan. Cortés collected an army as he went. And this is kind of what empires do, how they succeed at conquering people. They make use of existing divisions within the society they want to conquer. Cortés and the Spanish took advantage of the divisions in Aztec society and was therefore able to raise an army from the Native Americans. When Cortez arrived at Tenochtitlan, the Aztec emperor rode out to meet him. He was named Montezuma, and he rode out of the capital on November 8th, 1519, expecting to exchange gifts with the newcomers, perhaps creating a new alliance. Maybe these people had some good stuff they wanted to trade. But Cortez marched into the city, and, with his native army, and with superior European technology, you read about the technology, the weapons, and so on, Spain was able to conquer the capital city Tenochtitlan, and with it, the Aztec Empire. That's how the Aztec Empire ended on a specific date in 1520. It's how Spain first acquired Mexico as a colony. The Incan Empire ended in a similar way, in 1532, in the capital city of Cajamarca. Remember, the Inca peoples lived in the mountains of present-day Peru, and their emperor was called Atahualpa. You'll see his name in just a minute. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro made his way to the capital of the Incas, and with only 168 men was able to capture the emperor, Atahualpa. Pizarro demanded a ransom to the Inca people. If they wanted their leader back, they needed to pay. So they did pay. And Pizarro killed him anyway. This image will reappear later when I talk about the Black Legend of Spain and the English resentment of Spain and its colonies. For now, though, it's a picture of Atahualpa being killed by gunfire while he's on his throne. And this marks the end of the Incan Empire and its conquest by Spain. I call this one of the starting lines here on the outline. It's the starting point for the game with many players. The starting line for a race for the resources of the New World. Spain was successful at settling and exploiting the New World. It mined gold and silver, and it gave away huge tracts of land to settlers. This was the encomienda system, a system of giving away land and labor to settlers who would grow crops or manage mines for the benefit of the mother country. In the story of Spain and its conquest of the Americas, we see some of the lessons that most empires learn as they grow. First, it's all good, at least for the conqueror. Spain's gold and silver mines gave it a lot of precious metal. They could buy anything they wanted. And this position gave Spain a lot of power in the world, hegemonic in its world system. But 40% of the native population died in the 1500s, slaving away in the mines or by diseases. 40%. And even with all that gold and silver, the Spanish Empire lost its way. It spent most of its money on holy wars against Islam and the Ottoman Empire. It spent even more fighting European powers, and that's where it really lost out. Spain suffered a crushing defeat in the European wars, when the Peace of Utrecht in 1713 divested Spain of most of its European holdings, Netherlands included. You can consult your textbook for more on European geopolitics at this time, and the role played by Europe's New World empires. Because Spain no longer had control of other countries in Europe, it hung on to its overseas empire even more tenaciously and expanded from Tenochtitlan northward. Supporting this expansion was a complex political structure and settlers, farmers, and mine owners. The Spanish Empire in the Americas lasted well into the 1800s, and we'll encounter it again here in Texas. But this was the origin point, or starting line, of Spanish Empire in the Americas, Spain's conquest of the Aztec and Incan empires in 1520 and 1532, and settling in from there. And Spain succeeded in its conquest by exploiting divisions within these native populations. This is a characteristic of imperialism that France used too. And France was one of Spain's main competitors in this contest for the resources of the New World. Let's return to this map, which shows French Empire in North America at its widest extent. The French were traders who made it deep into the interior of the continent. They didn't just cling to the coast, They used rivers and seaways and Great Lakes to make it into the interior. And they'd settle in these little forts and trade with the natives. Here's a map that shows the extent of French forts and French Empire in North America. You can see that it's basically the whole interior of the country, from Quebec and Montreal, up here at the top of the Hudson River, all the way through the Great Lakes, and all the way down to New Orleans. Each of these little red huts is another French fort or settlement. Now, let me tell a little story to express the ways that France and Spain competed against each other for New World territory. Here's a map of La Salle's exploration of the Mississippi in the 1600s. La Salle is French, and he's coming down the riverine French Empire. He comes down from Montreal, through the Great Lakes, through the river system, picks up the Mississippi River, and comes out in Louisiana, named for King Louis of France, of course. That's French territory for centuries. But he claimed that the Mississippi comes out not where it does, but instead where the Brazos River does. You can see the purple arrow, that he headed back up that way when he came back, thinking he'd end up the Mississippi. This is a map from 1688 that demonstrates what they thought the geography was like. This is actually a globe made in 1688, and we have this very globe here on the Texas Tech campus. It's called the Coronelli Globe, and it's over in the Southwest Collection next to the library. This globe is always on display. When the library is open, you can go in and see that Coronelli, who made the globe in 1688 based on the accounts of the New World, thought that the Mississippi River comes out of the continent where the Brazos River really does. He may have based this globe on La Salle's account of his explorations, since the two of them made the same mistake. But was it a mistake? There are those who believe that it was a deliberate lie, because if, in fact, La Salle had followed the Mississippi all the way into Texas, then French claims would be much closer to New Spain than it was. Maybe the French would invest a little more in their New World territories and commit to settling them to get at the silver from the imagined mines. Go on down to the Southwest Collection next to the library and have a look. This episode from The Game of Many Players. The race of European nations for New World territories has left a trace on our own campus, in our own archival collections. But the French were more interested in trade than in settlement. They didn't usually build farms and send families. The French established this system of forts where they collected furs from Native Americans who came there to trade. Most especially, they bought beaver skins. Here's the skin. And here's a beaver. They let the natives hunt them, and they bought the skins, which they wanted to turn into hats. This, to me, is one of the really strange parts of this story. The European fashion for hats made of beaver fur, for which the natives essentially depopulated the continent of beavers to trade for European goods, things like cooking pans and beads for trade and prestige, hats, driving imperial conquest. Here's the plan of a French fort. And in places like this, they'd trade for skins brought in by mostly Huron natives. So the New France Empire stretched all the way from the top of the Hudson River, down across the Great Lakes, through the river system, all the way down to New Orleans here on the Gulf of Mexico. New Orleans, founded 1718. When the French did turn to farming and settling, they grew mostly sugar. Remember the importance of sugar in modern history as the origins of the plantation system. French plantations to grow sugar were granted to settlers in long strips so that each one would have access to the river, so they could sell their sugar down the river to New Orleans, out into the Gulf and to Europe, the whole length of the Mississippi, divided up for French sugar plantations. Like this one. Of course, the French were competing for New World resources with the English, as well as with the Spanish. In the north, the French and English Empire were right up against each other. and competed with each other. Both sides used native tribes to fight against the other side. Each was allied with a tribe that was already fighting the other tribe. The Iroquois natives and the Huron natives had been fighting each other for a long time, and the British created an alliance with the Iroquois tribes. In 1677, creating the Covenant Chain. This was an association of several tribes. Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca Indians were united under a constitution. Like Europeans, these tribes had an agriculture-based economy, and their societies were complex and hierarchical, based on the exchange of agricultural surplus. When European manufactured goods arrived, the natives incorporated them into their existing trade patterns. Here are cooking pots and beads. Manufactured in Europe, but used by Iroquois tribes. And here are some of the things they made themselves. Combs. Beautiful. The Iroquois tribes never traded with the Hurons, and they were enemies. So if the Iroquois were allied with the English, then the Hurons were allied with the French, and the empires took advantage of their fights against each other. Divide and conquer, the imperial way. So, the Spanish, French, and English empires were fighting each other for the resources of the New World. And the English were latecomers, clinging to the coast, while the French had the whole riverine interior, and the Spanish had silver mines and encomienda plantations. But these three European empires weren't the only ones. The Dutch also had an American empire, and in order to understand it, let me get a little closer into the geography. Here in the 13 colonies, you can see a big bay. That's the Chesapeake Bay, and here's a little hook or protuberance. This map, which I'm going to use again when I talk about the English coast, shows the geography of the 13 English colonies pretty clearly. Here's the big Chesapeake Bay, and here's a smaller bay. That's Delaware. And this little hook is where Boston is now. Now, look below it and find the whale-shaped island, whose nose points to the continent. And here again, the hook, and the whale-shaped island. That island is nowadays called Long Island, and at its tip is New York City, what was claimed by the Dutch in the 17th century, and their city of New Amsterdam. You can see French settlements up the Hudson River, above Albany, and below it. At the bottom of the river is the island of Manhattan, just past the tip of the Whale Island. Here, the Dutch settled on the tip of New Amsterdam, and they built a wall to protect their settlement from the wilderness to the north. Here's the wall, a fortification, and today that's Wall Street. So the Dutch settlements left a mark there. And north of the wall, they had some farms, which stretched all the way along the Hudson River. Here's the hook, and Long Island, shaped like a whale, and the Hudson River, stretching up toward the French Empire. And here, a close-up of the Hudson River, marked with Dutch farms, Manor Rensselaer, Livingston, laid out in a strip with river access, just like the sugar plantations of the French, down along the Mississippi, just like the old feudal societies of medieval Europe. In 1664, King Charles of England granted his brother James vast American territories that included all of New Netherland. He sent a fleet to New Amsterdam, where General Stuyvesant, without a fleet or even a real army to defend his colony, surrendered. Was forced to surrender New Amsterdam to the English in 1664. So in September of that year, New York was born, effectively ending the Dutch direct involvement in North America. But the Dutch still played a role as traders along the English coast, as we shall see when we study the English colonial economies. And let me offer just a few more short examples of other European settlers so you can realize how many there were at work in the 17th century. There's New Sweden, for example, a real world power, with its own explorers, settled along the Delaware River. This is the Delaware Bay, with its own kind of triangle trade. They were driven out of New Sweden in 1655 by the Dutch, before the Dutch themselves fell to the English. So, when we look at this picture of the 13 original colonies of American history, now we can place it in its context. The English settlers competed with the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch settlers, and used Indian tribes against each other in order to secure their own tenuous colonies. The Virginia colony, settled in 1607, and the New England colonies around Massachusetts Bay, here at the Hook. And it's these English colonies that I'll discuss next time.